I'm going to just share something.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. I'm going to share something, and those of you who've been my students may have seen some of this earlier. Um, what can I say? It appears that you have to repeat things which are based on solid research over and over and over again, and yet it doesn't seem to percolate. They say that if you repeat a lie over and over again, it seems to be the truth. Here, when you have something which is something that is validated through research, even then we do find that there is a problem in getting people to see the validity that we are talking about. So my students, apologies, you're going to see something that is very, very familiar to you. But I thought, nevertheless, that I will persevere and go with this. Can you see this particular slide, which has some cartoon images?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yeah, yeah. So generally when we talk about prehistory, hunter gatherer societies, and so on, this idea of a caveman that comes in is something that is very striking. This guy, with burly biceps. I now understand why people go around calling themselves something biceps, etc. They want to perhaps project themselves in a certain way. But nevertheless, what you see through such kind of imagery is this idea of this burly guy, hairy and broad, and holding a club, and walking around and beating women to submission, so that they can cohabit with them, and so on. And then there is this there are these other sets of cartoons that you'll also find, where slowly there's a move away from nature towards culture, apparently. And what is that a move signifying? It means that you're no longer hitting them over the head with a club. You still hold the club, but and so your power is not to be mistaken. But what you do is you also start wearing hats, you start becoming chivalrous, you doff your hat to the woman, and that's how you get her. So this whole idea of a caveman, of caveman tactics, all of this is what goes into what we call the myth of the alpha male. And this myth is something that actually comes up in different ways over different periods of time. But this coinage of alpha male that we have, this term itself of alpha male, actually comes up only in the 20th century. And that too in the mid 20th century, this idea is gradually developing. And it comes up mainly because of the kinds of studies on non-human primate behavior. Particularly primate behavior, animal behavior in general, but primate behavior becomes very central to this, because we are seen as belonging to the same family. But one of the earliest studies to use this term alpha male is by David Meck in 1970, where he studied the wolf and the wolf family, the packs of wolves, their behavior, and how within that pack you have what he defined as the alpha male figure. And then later, a decade later, you have this very well known work of Franz de Waal, which studied the chimpanzees. So, coming to those whom humans are seen to be much closer to, and on the basis of that chimpanzee behavior, he talks about the alpha
No.
male. Am I audible again? Please do let me know if I'm not, if I'm not my audio goes off at some point, video goes off at some point, and so on. Huh? My slide is also showing
Yes, ma'am.
on the myth of the alpha male. Yeah. So this is something that we also need to keep in mind, that yes, the idea of a muscular protective male who from prehistoric times has been the more that those waves don't stop, because it is very important to understand that these waves also are contextual. So in the first wave, the emphasis was more on voting rights for women, on having some kind of equal say in the public sphere, and so on. But in the second wave, that's where the issues related to equality come up in a major way in public discourse, in the feminist circles, as part of the feminist movements. And it is in the third wave that you have a questioning of certain kinds of constructs, an understanding of the way in which women's lives, as well as that of men and those of other sexualities, were structured, were institutionalized, and were legitimized through certain kinds of myths and institutions, and so on. So the third wave feminism is where we actually see a significant shift in terms of our understanding of concepts. For instance, that concept formation itself is something that is steeped in bias. And when we look at this particular book, which is called Towards an Anthropology of Women, edited by Reina Rater, if I'm not mistaken, this was published in 1975. Yeah, in 1975. And this book comes out at the cusp of the third wave. Already, that means there was a questioning of concepts and ideas that were widely prevalent in society and also in academia. And it is this that was being questioned by feminist scholars. And Reina Rater's book draws our attention to this. What does this book talk about? In this book, one of the main things that Reina Rater talks about is male bias in anthropology, about how there is a certain way in which those who were going into the field, especially because anthropology requires field work. So, those who were going into the field went with certain assumptions. Even when they were being given information, even when the data that they were collecting was not in consonance, what they did was they reworked that data and presented things in such a way that it conformed to those biases, those stereotypes that they carried into the field. The second thing that Reina Rater and the authors who have contributed to this volume have said is that a very dominant assumption had been that biology is destiny, anatomy is destiny. Our physiological makeup is what determines the way we are in society. And here they use this binary of the male and the female to talk about how these kinds of assumptions have been projected. As I said, this is still before the third wave really picks up, when we
Mhm.
have a very important distinction that is being made conceptually, which is that sex is a term that denotes the physiological difference that we can identify between what we may call a male body and a female body, whereas gender is something that goes beyond the physiological construction, and it can go beyond the binary of male and female as well. In other words, that you can have the female sex and the male sex, but when we talk about the female gender, when we talk about what is feminine as opposed to what is masculine, or when we talk about alternate ways in which we understand our gender, that is something that goes beyond the physiological difference. So we're yet to arrive at that kind of a very clear conceptual categorization in Reina Rater's work, but nevertheless, we are at the cusp of that in this particular work. So it's a very, very fascinating and interesting work, which is telling us about how important it is for us to look critically even at what appears to be valid research that is based on sources, on field work, and so on. Even that needs to be critically looked at and dissected. Um, Now, when we look at the way in which scholars who have contributed to this volume have discussed the issue of sex and gender, even when they have not necessarily talked of it in these ways. One of the things that they talk about is that, yes, there are certain physical characteristics. And generally, when we talk about physical characteristics, for instance, this is a gibbon or this is an orangutan. So when we talk about physical characteristics, we can see that there are some significant differences between the male of a species and a female of a species, which we may call dimorphism, right? So when we look at the gibbon, can you see the gibbon? Yeah. When we look at the gibbon, what we see is that there is no significant sexual dimorphism between the male and the female. In other words, that they look alike, they almost weigh the same, about 13 to 16 pounds. And when we look at the orangutan, on the other hand, what we have is a very marked sexual dimorphism. We have the male orangutan who can weigh about 160 pounds and a female one who can weigh about 80 pounds. Now, the work of Leela Leibowitz takes this new research focus of ethology forward by critiquing this idea that the alpha male is a characteristic of all species in all contexts, right? And so she focuses on certain kinds of primates, the non-human actors in the natural world. And what does she talk about? She says, let's see what kind of sex difference actually exists amongst them. And as I said, you have the gibbon with no major sexual dimorphism, but obviously, the females had certain specific reproductive functions. Now, when we look at the way in which the gibbons organize themselves, we find that largely the males and the females forage, they find food, they build their nests together or separately, and that both are invested in protection. In other words, that both can be equally aggressive in the way in which they ward off those who are seen to be threats. And there's also some kind of indication of um, a familial bonding, in the sense that when a male and a female of this species, of the gibbon species, live together, they do live like a family, where it is born, they both work towards protecting the child. This doesn't mean that they are permanent partners. It only means that at the point when they are together, there is this kind of a behavior that can be identified. Now, when we look at the orangutan, which where, as I've just shown you in a picture, you have very conspicuous sexual dimorphism. What is very, very striking is that largely amongst orangutans, you have females who are the ones who form the groups. Hmm? You have males who have these very loud voices. They have these goitrous throat sacs, which can be visible. And the greater the throat sac, the louder the voice, and so on, that can be heard. But what you do find is that the females are the ones who direct the way in which the group functions, the extent to which the foraging will take place, and so on. And what is also interesting is that it is not merely a female group where you have a mother with the children, but you can also have multiple such groups. That is, two or more mothers who would be coming together to form a group. Hmm? And they work together, and yes, of course, they do cohabit with the males occasionally, and they allow the males into the group occasionally. But you also find that the females spurn the males quite often. And this is something that is recorded over a fairly long period. Many of these ethologists have worked with these kinds of animals over a very long period, or have studied their behavior over a very long period. Now, when we come to the gorilla, we find that sexual dimorphism is very, very marked, and you have female groups largely with one adult male that is visible. And and when you have a young one who is a male who is gradually coming into adulthood, normally these adults are pushed out of the group and they have to move around alone. And they might come back into the group just to cohabit, but they generally are pushed out. It is what are called the silver backed adult males. So, this idea of the alpha male is also one where there is something very physically visible about the alpha male that can help us identify that. So possibly it's coming from some quack, some very superficial understanding of say the gorillas with the silverback male and so on. But what we do find is that you do have this adult male, but this silverback male can be replaced within the group. And then we have the chimpanzee, where there is slighter sexual dimorphism. So it's primarily the gorilla and the chimpanzee where we have a greater correspondence as far as humans and non-humans in very, very ancient times, in prehistoric times, that there is a correspondence that can be identified between them. So they are our closest ancestors in that sense. So it's slighter sexual dimorphism. But again, what we see is that amongst the chimpanzees, when you have a grouping of male and female, at times you have a group of many females with one male. At times, you have one male with one female. At times, you have a big group with more than one male, and so on. So, you have different kinds of social patterns that are visible to us. Now, when people have built upon this idea of the alpha male, what they have done is they have cherry picked from some of these studies that have been undertaken on prehistoric communities, and assumed that the prehistoric groups were very much like the primates or like other animals in the natural world. Because the problem over here in trying to project these social relationships, this understanding of what is male and what is female into prehistory is that what we have as evidence for us is mainly archaeological material. And that archaeological material by itself cannot tell us about these issues, these ways in which societies organize themselves, these ways in which societies construed of identities, either of a group itself or of the male and the female within the group. So it's in that sense that these kinds of studies seemed to be quite interesting and possibly illuminating, and that's why a lot of such work was undertaken in the 20th century and even earlier. But what we can see from the work of Leela Leibovitz, where she very clearly goes through the evidence, is that we do not have, when we look closely at the evidence, any single social evolutionary track. Meaning that there is nothing to tell us that sexual dimorphism is something that is natural, and that is something that leads to certain characteristic traits in species, whether they are male or female. In fact, one of the things that Leibovitz as well as Reina Rater talk about is that the issue of cultural plasticity, meaning that multiple ways in which there can be a cultural evolution which has to be differentiated from the natural or the physiological constitution of people. This is something that needs to be studied and identified, and it is visible, as Leibovitz says, even amongst the non humans. So, that is a very, very important issue for us to keep in mind. Now, another issue that we need to think about is this issue of hunting. Why do we have so much of importance that is given to the alpha male? And one very important issue that has often been raised is that the alpha male idea or concept comes from the fact that men have always had to shoulder the responsibility of looking after, protecting, providing for those who are under him. And who is under him? There is a woman, and then there are children. So the second thing then that is attached to this idea, so man has to provide for. So why does he have to provide for? Because naturally it is believed that men are more aggressive. They have that violent instinct in them. They have the capacity to fight and to be provoked, and that they can go and kill. That the killer instinct is something that is there in men, and therefore uh, men are the ones who went out and killed animals. As we know, for a very, very long time after humans or the hominids came into existence, we largely they depended on nature. They depended on other animals to hunt and kill, and largely the hominids were scavengers. They would go and eat. If meat was an important part of their diet, it was because of the hunt of other species. So when those species would eat their fill and go away, the hominids would go and they would scavenge along with other scavengers, and would eat what remained. But over the millennia, because of certain physiological transformations that took place, as well as because of the way in which uh, cognitive understanding developed, that is, the brain developed, the human brain developed, we do see, at least from the time that the Homo species, to be differentiated from the hominid species, the Homo species, when they come into existence, you find that hunting gradually appears to be coming in. And this becomes more visible to us when we look at the Neanderthals as well as the Homo sapiens sapiens. And particularly when we look at the Homo sapiens sapiens, we find that uh, uh, closer to our times, that is about 20,000 years ago, or maybe even 50,000 years ago, there seems to have been a refinement in the way or in the techniques that were used to hunt animals. So, in other words, that there is a long period of evolution through prehistoric times, and it is only in the very recent past, when we think in terms of geological time, that we find hunting becomes visible to us in the archaeological record. And this hunting then involved the creation of certain kinds of tools. So you had these sharp points that suggest to us that there is a greater strategy that is evolved towards stalking and killing of animals, which has been devised by Homo sapiens sapiens, by groups of Homo sapiens sapiens. And in different regions, we can find where there is a footprint of these species, we do find that hunting becomes very, very important, or at least it is visible to us that there was a lot of debris that suggests to us that they did kill animals frequently, and this formed, and meat therefore formed an important part of the diet. Now, what was then posited in a number of works was that it was men who had this natural um, proclivity towards hunting, because they had that killer instinct, and therefore the man was the one who became the hunter. And it is because of men then that cultural evolution took place, and the notion of a society, a cohesive society, where certain kind of provision for the social whole as well as protection of the social whole comes about, and all of this is provided by men. And this is where people like Reina Rater and Sally Slocum talk about male bias, where there is nothing in the in the archaeological record that is immediately suggesting to us that it is only men who were hunting, but this presumption that in prehistoric times, thousands of years ago, it is men who actually lead the society forward. And how do they lead it forward? Because they provide for the social whole through hunting, through the pursuit of hunting. Now, this is challenged by people like Sally Slocum, who argue that even if we were to accept that hunting is something, we know that it is something that becomes refined, it is something that becomes, you know, more strategic in terms of how to hunt and so on, how to stalk an animal, how to locate patterns of movements of animals, and so on. All of this is visible to us. But so, if we were to accept this, what we would also need to then consider is that hunting very often was seasonal, and therefore, and hunting also involved a lot of planning. Thirdly, hunting also would have meant a lot of casualties. So, hunting could not have been something that was regular. If hunting was not regular, then how did the social whole subsist? What kind of food did the social whole gain? And how did they live? And therefore, the idea that it is foraging, gathering of roots, of fruits, of herbs, and so on, and gradually the processing of what is available in nature, either in the plant world, or even once the meat is something that is understood as capable of being preserved in certain ways, that this is an activity that would have largely been in the domain of women. Hmm? And therefore, if at all we are to look at cultural progression, we would need to see the importance of the activity of gathering and foraging that would have allowed for the daily sustenance and subsistence of society. So, if we are at all to look at the movement towards civilization, it is because of these kinds of efforts rather than because of the hunt per se. And therefore, this privileging of the male who is the hunter, man the hunter, is coming from a bias that anthropologists were taking into the field, or archaeologists were taking into the field. And so, using the kind of anthropological material that was coming out from different contexts, whether it was in the case of many societies in Africa or in Australia, where people still subsisted on hunting and gathering. So, using this as a model, scholars then tried to see how can we. So, this is something that was already happening from the 19th century, but now with this critical method of trying to not go with certain stereotypes, but to look at the data from the way in which these societies actually subsisted. One found that there was actually considerable difference in the ways in which hunter gatherer societies functioned. In some societies, you had a more or less egalitarian kind of milieu in which men and women participated in different kinds of activities, whether it is hunting, whether it is foraging, whether it is in tool making, whether it is in nurturing. So, for instance, in the case of this study of a society in the Kalahari desert, you find that the people even ostracized those who were aggressive. That is, if you showed, if people threw tantrums, even children threw tantrums, they were ostracized. Nobody would pay any attention to them until the person, even the child, would accept that this is not something that they can indulge in, and then only would they be allowed to come back into the society, into the social grouping. But there were other groupings also, and this Reina Rater draws our attention to, where you do have a significant difference in the activities of men and women. Hmm? The point that we need to ask is whether there is a significant difference in the activities of men and women or not. What is the reason for the emergence of patriarchies? What is the reason for the emergence of the idea of male dominance, which gains wide acceptance? Male dominance over resources. And Engels here talks about the evolution of private property as being the reason for the evolution of male dominance. But Simone de Beauvoir in that wonderful work of hers, The Second Sex, says, but how is it that women accept this? That men will control the resources. And here she brings in the issue of the cultural basis of this kind of an idea, this kind of a stereotype of male dominance, male aggression, accepting the protection of the male, and the way in which patriarchies then come to roost over vast periods of history. So, this is something that is very important for us to consider. And Boava draws our attention to literature as well as visual media, which reinforce these ideas, where these are myths that are created. There are myths that are created in religion as well as in literature, which is meant for edification, which is meant for entertainment. Even there you have these kinds of ideas that are perpetuated, and they can be classical, they can be of a higher order, or it can be at the popular level that such literature, visual media is able to command the attention and is able to disseminate such ideas. Now, in the modern period, this is something that takes on a different kind of importance, or a different kind of speed, shall we say, where capitalism, the projection of a certain kind of glamour lifestyle, the kind that Andrew Tate and others project, whom we call social media influencers, project, the consumerism that is a part of it, that is projected over their cinema, is again something that we see that is projecting these kinds of myths and ideas at a speed that is quite mind boggling. And this is where we would need to look at the way in which, say, a film like Animal, or that like Arjun Reddy, or even something like Bahubali, is able to disseminate these ideas, and also able to rake in the mullah, that people are ready to consume this. And I think it's also important for us to understand, when we think of the way in which such myths perpetuate, it is not as if these are being forced down our throat. That is the whole point of hegemony, that we participate as men and women in the perpetuation of these myths which work against us. So when we talk about the perpetuation of the myth of the alpha male, we also have to critically look at the way in which we consume certain kinds of literature, if we can call it literature. When I was a student, there was this whole romance a genre, a popular publication called Mills and Boon, which every young person would carry around. And a lot of the stuff in that Mills and Boon was very uh, misogynistic. It was about how these men were so dominating, even abusive to the women. In some cases, they were rapists. They raped these women, and yet the women fell for them. So the Stockholm syndrome being naturalized and normalized. And you do find, I'm sure there are newer versions of this that are available if Mills and Boon is no longer popular. But certainly, cinema is something that has been able to project these kinds of ideas and images in a more vivid manner, because of the way in which it is not merely the written, it's the verbal and the visual that come together. There is, as I said, that glamour that is attached to it. So, a man who is abusive, especially if he's rich, everything is forgiven about him, as I believe is the case in Animal. I haven't seen the film, I've only seen that particular, but I presume that those would be the ways in which we need to understand this whole phenomenon of how we buy into these myths, how we allow or how we ourselves participate in the perpetuation of these kinds of ideas. I'll stop over there, and I would really like to hear other people. The reason being that it perplexes me, it saddens me. It also makes me more determined that we need to fight with greater vigor these kinds of ideas and stereotypes, because these are things that we thought had been resolved. Women in the 80s thought they had resolved these issues. For those of us growing up into adulthood in the 90s, we thought we had resolved this. But coming into the 2020s, we find ourselves going back full circle. And that is where I think that the academic critique, going back to these wonderful works like Reina Rater's Towards an Anthropology of Women, is very important. Going to newer research is also very important. But equally important is for us to have movements that are going to contest and critique these kinds of ideas, because let's not forget that the that race, caste, all of these have been contested primarily because of movements. That feminists have even brought such issues into the forefront has been because of the feminist movement. Scholars have brought this because of the feminist movement. So I'm particularly happy that we, the women of India, has initiated this kind of a discussion, and I do hope that we can carry our discussions into other forums as well, and engage with those who do think that there is some validity to these kinds of myths. Last, I'll stop with this. As I said, do bring this up in a course that I teach called Ancient Societies. And over the past 10 years, each and every time when I discuss this, I have definitely a few people in the class who will argue and argue with me. But isn't it natural? Men are bigger, women are smaller, men's brains are more tuned to certain things, women's brains are more inclined towards certain kinds of things, and so on. um, all this talk about brain research, um, a lot of it is very, very inconclusive. I don't think there is any way that we can say for sure that this is the way men think and this is the way women think, unless we are going to do a sample of 2 billion people who populate this earth. So I think that these are very false ideas to have these small samples of 1 and 2 and 10 and 50 people and then say this is how men and women think. And the second thing is that yes, you may have men who are bigger largely than women in size, their body mass is greater, and so on. uh, but we also know that there is a maybe a minority, but there is a section of men who are not that, right? What are we doing to them by perpetuating such myths of alpha males? What about those women who are not the sweet and the women who need protection, who can't cross a road, who can't go from their homes to their schools or colleges or workplace without a man accompanying them? Huh? But we also know that there are, I don't think a minority, a huge number of women who go to the fields and work, who go to the factories and work, who are on the roads, who are working, who are students, who are living in hostels. They don't work in these situations with male protectors around them all the time, hmm? Or even some of the time. So these are very false ideas that we tend to work with. And I think it's very important for us to have these conversations to think of how, we can maybe bust these myths. Thank you very much.
Uh, Thank you so much, ma'am. That was such a detailed and wonderful presentation. And मतलब जितनों की भी कैमरास ऑन थे, आई कुड सी कि सभी लोग इतना बड़ा स्माइल कर रहे थे व्हेन यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट बस्टिंग ऑल दीज मिथ्स, क्योंकि जब पहली बार ये सब सुनते हैं एंड इट्स लाइक कि नहीं यार, जितना बचपन से सुना था, नाउ वी हैव concrete arguments to fight these things back, because ये सारी चीजें आप डे टू डे कॉन्वर्सेशंस में कहीं ना कहीं से सुनते हैं. एंड दैट इज व्हाई वी हैड कंडक्टेड दिस सेशन कि जितने भी लोग हैं जो हु आर willing to fight against these ideas, they need to have the correct information and the arguments to fight these ideas. क्योंकि कई बार जिनको ये चीजें कंफर्टेबल भी नहीं लगती, उनके पास भी कॉन्क्रीट आर्ग्यूमेंट्स नहीं होती to fight back. So this was the basic idea, and we hope people will take back from this. We want to have as much interaction as possible, but before we go on to that, just a sec.